Precepts incense, samadhi incense, wisdom incense, liberation incense, cloud of lighted incense, pouring into the Dharma realms, offering to the highest teachers of the 10 directions. I respectfully bow to the incense god Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense god Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense god Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to all directions of space, all realms, past, present, and future, all Buddhas, the honored Dharma, the enlightened Sangha, the permanent three treasures. I respectfully bow to our own teacher, Sakyamuni Buddha, the future born Maitreya Buddha, great wisdom, Manjushri Bodhisattva, great practice, Samantabhadra Bodhisattva, Dharma protector Bodhisattvas, all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas assembled at the great holy mountain. I respectfully bow to the great love, great compassion, Amitabha Buddha of the Western Paradise, great compassion, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, great power, Siddhigarbha Bodhisattva, great power, Mahastamapada Bodhisattva, all the Bodhisattvas in the great pure ocean. Good morning. Thank you for being with me here today. Just realized I went off and left my phone in the other room, so I can't see your chat comments, but that's okay. I'll get it when I get through talking. So listen, I'm just going to warn you, this is not going to be the best Dharma talk I've ever given. Might not even be the best Dharma talk I've given this week. Here's why. I was actually preparing to talk about something different. And I hope that lawnmower is not too loud. I hope it doesn't stay in my neighbor's backyard too long. But I was planning to talk about Buddhism and science. Someone asked a question about that last Sunday, and I thought that would be a good Dharma talk. And then other things happened. And so I spent some time preparing a Dharma talk about that this week. But I feel it's more important to talk about something else today. So we've just ended a difficult week marked by protests and rioting over police brutality and things like that, yet again. I remember a few months ago, I added some language to the dedication at the end of our prayers because it seemed like there was always some horrible thing going on and that we needed to pray for. So, and this is another example of that. So, and another thing is a friend of mine, a friend of a friend, really. I think I've met this fellow once or twice, but he's on Facebook. He's a friend of another minister. I posted something on Facebook this week about where are all the white pastors? Why aren't they talking about this? And I posted that, I talk about intolerance and stuff like that. But afterward, I thought, I don't really address this sort of thing very directly. And I try to stay non-political. And there's a reason for that. I would never want anyone to feel like if they came to a Buddhist fellowship service or if they came to White Sands or whatever, that I would not be welcoming to them, that my compassion would not extend to them because they have different political views than mine. So I try not to talk about it very often. But I think it's important to talk about tolerance. And in the process today, I'm going to talk about reason and the need for compassion for everyone and that kind of thing. But I have to admit right up front that some of the things I've seen this week make it very difficult for me to feel reasonable and to feel compassion. Seeing that video of a police officer killing George Floyd I feel hatred arise just like you do. And that's not the only thing that's happened this week, or at least it was talked about this week. There was that bogus stand your ground shooting, and there was well, I'm not going to go over it because I don't want to get mad. But this hasn't been a good week for tolerance, and we need to work on that. We really do. So, look, I haven't always been tolerant. I haven't always practiced it. I grew up in Texas. My mom watches these, so I'm going to be careful what I say. No, I'm kidding. For white folks in Texas, in the 1960s, my family was probably more accepting of others than the average family. But given the time and place, that's not saying very much. I was introduced to intolerance by whomever, in a relatively non-aggressive form. Nobody ever told me that ethnic minorities were bad. It's just that white middle-class Baptists were better than everybody else. And I did question that opinion. I remember a Sunday dinner at my grandparents' house and being told that at some point earlier, a minority family had tried to attend the church. My grandfather was a deacon there, and apparently my grandfather and the other deacons had directed that family to a church where they would be more welcome. And I said that didn't sound very Christian to me. At that point, the civil rights movement was kind of at its peak. This would have been at some point in the late 60s. I don't remember exactly when. So the Civil Rights Act had already been enacted and that sort of thing. But Americans were still divided over issues like this. In my opinion, wasn't welcome at that particular table at that time. So Buddhists are fairly tolerant. It's kind of programmed into the teachings. There's a lot of facets to this issue, and so it's worth visiting. I'd like to say that I was so blessed with good karma that I was born immune to racism and intolerance, but that really wouldn't be truthful. I've managed most of my life, I think, to question the obvious forms of intolerance when I encountered them. But real universal tolerance can be very elusive. And it's kind of hard sometimes to figure out how to work action and reaction to these sorts of things into a Buddhist practice. I have, if you look at my lineage chart that I got as part of my Soto Zen ordination, there's a guy a few rungs up the ladder from me. Was the founder of Zen Peacemakers, Bernie Glassman, Roshi. And Zen Peacemakers really does kind of go out into the world and try to create action that will address social injustice. And they have a three-part process. And the first part is not knowing. And not knowing is very important. It's a very intimate practice. It means I don't go into something with a bunch of preconceived ideas about it. I go in open to what's there, and then I bear witness to what unfolds. And then that which is the second tenet. The third tenet is to take action. So it's hard to know what kind of action you can take that's aligned with the principles of compassion and equanimity and things like that. But just about everybody experiences some form of intolerance. Scientists, people who study the brain say that the mind has a module that's in charge of deciding who belongs with our kind of folks and who belongs over there with those people. And that probably served important purpose in our species past, but it causes a lot of difficulty now. When I was a reporter, I covered a commission meeting once where the commission had been accused of being racist. And one commissioner, who was a nice guy, Congregationalist minister, politically pretty liberal, he and I became friends, but he reacted very strongly to this accusation. He said, "I'm not prejudiced against anybody." And then he thought for a minute, and he said, "Well, I guess I'm prejudiced against bigots." And that's the problem, is that, we find it fairly easy to be tolerant towards some groups of people. and yet feel justified in being closed off toward other groups of people. Tolerance is a little like compassion in the sense that it's fairly easy to feel it for people that we like, but it's not so easy to be tolerant for or compassionate toward people that we don't like very much. There's all kinds of intolerance at work on social, institutional levels and on personal, individual levels. We can lack tolerance for somebody not only because of the color of their skin, but because of their social class, their sexual preference, their gender, their religion, their political affiliations, their weight, their fashion choices, whether or not they eat meat, what accent they have, what kind of music they like. I mean, the list of ways we can exclude others from our hearts is endless. So we have no shortage of opportunities to be intolerant. But we're not stuck with that. Tolerance is actually a learnable skill. The dictionary defines tolerance as the willingness to accept feelings, habits, or beliefs that are different from our own. So it's the ability to accept, experience, or survive something harmful or unpleasant. And in medical usage, the ability to become adjusted to something so that its effects are experienced less strongly. So these sound like different things, but if we look at tolerance not as something that we just have or we feel or whatever, but as something we do, as something we practice, then you can see these as steps in the process. So think about this as a hypothetical situation. Two cultural factions with a lot of animosity between them. Imagine that. That happens, right? So someone comes along and says, hey, let's try to be a unified community. So how would you create unity? First, you might get yourself and others to direct the mind toward accepting habits and beliefs that are different from your own. So when we try to be more culturally diverse, for example, that's where we start. We accept that those things that make up culture, which mainly involve beliefs and habits, might be different without being somehow evil. So this is a willful, deliberate process. We begin by saying to one another, look, I disagree with your beliefs or your way of life or whatever, but I'm going to accept your right to be this way. And that's the first step, to accept another's right to do what they do, even if we don't like it, and even if we think it's mistaken to do it. The second part of this definition is to experience and survive something harmful or unpleasant. So this is step two. You get along even if you don't like it. You might have unpleasant feelings arise, but you experience the unpleasantness, you manage to live through it. And so now we can turn to the medical definition. It's sort of a physical process of step three. You become adjusted to something so that its effects are experienced less strongly. In other words, you get used to the unpleasant feelings and they eventually go away. Or at least they diminish to the part that they don't seem that significant. If you think about this on a societal level, we went through something like this three-step process in the civil rights movement. And we're going through it now. We've been through it with things like same-sex marriage and medical marijuana. At some point, people start saying, okay, I don't think I like this, but I see the point. You deserve the same rights as everybody else. And so that's the acceptance phase. I don't like you, but I accept your right to be here. And then maybe black and white people sit together on a bus. And a straight person goes to a same-sex marriage. Unpleasant feelings may arise, and if so, they're experienced, but they are survived and they diminish. So as we as individuals become tolerant, the body of society becomes adjusted to that, and it's experienced less strongly, and finally, perhaps fully accepted. So the Buddha had some ideas about tolerance. You know, you've heard the Buddhism referred to as the middle way. That doesn't mean everything in moderation. It's not a path of compromise between extremes. It really is a way to transcend extremes altogether. So seeing that one extreme doesn't offer a solution, nor does the other, Buddhist practice looks for a third approach. And so when we're talking about something like religion, where we have historically seen a fair amount of intolerance, you might see that one extreme might be what you call fundamentalism. I'm not crazy about that term, fundamentalism. There's nothing wrong, I don't think, with being aware of the fundamentals, the foundation of a religion, and turning to it for guidance. In fact, I think if you were truly a Christian fundamentalist, where would you go? The Beatitudes, that's kind of the basics of the religion, right? That you wouldn't be mean to anybody based on that. But when we examine fundamentalism in our world, we usually find something that's more like what Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's a Theravada monk and scholar, described as aggressive affirmation of one's own beliefs, cultivated with the proselytizing zeal toward anyone whose beliefs were different. In other words, you encounter somebody who believes differently than you do, and you aggressively assert your own beliefs, hoping that they will adopt them and change. So whether we're talking about extreme racism or other forms of institutionalized hate or intolerance on a personal individual level, I think that's a pretty good way of looking at it. If you think about arguments that you've had with coworkers or family members over the last few years over politics or whatever, if you look closely, often the conflict is based on aggressively reasserting your own point of view and insisting that the other person has to come around to agree with you. So Buddhists and Buddhism are not free from religious extremes, but usually when intolerance arises, religious intolerance, it's within Buddhism itself, not between Buddhism and other religions. Too often it happens, but it's not common. The bigger intolerances have been pretty rarefied. Most non-Buddhists wouldn't understand what the argument was about. But the Buddha didn't go around telling everybody they were wrong. He was pretty aggressive about making his teachings available, but there was never much of the proselytizing zeal that you see in some other religions. We have this concept of ehipassiko, which means come see for yourself. And so the Buddha's way of teaching was to present the truth as he saw it and just see if it worked for you. American Buddhists, I think, probably drawn to Buddhism because of that. And so we tend to be fairly liberal and fairly accepting of others. Also, a lot of us went through a period of being on the receiving end of intolerance, and so we want to be inclusive, and that's good. But we make a mistake when we adopt the idea that there's no important difference between religions. That I'll hear sometimes someone say all paths lead up the same mountain, and I disagree. I think all paths lead out of the same valley, the valley of human suffering, but they lead to different mountaintops. And I think that's okay. I think the view is good from all those mountaintops, right? And so when we kind of take this to the broader view of society, true tolerance isn't trying to reduce everything to sameness. It's not saying everybody's the same. It's accepting differentness, right? So the Buddha recognized that different people needed different things from their spiritual practices. And so the middle way provides a lot of different ways to access enlightenment. But the Buddha showed respect to priests and ascetics who followed other paths. So when we talk about cultural tolerance and political tolerance and tolerance among our relatives and coworkers, we don't have to reduce everything to sameness. We can welcome differentness. So this idea of being colorblind, we don't need to be colorblind. We can like having a lot of color in our world. In tolerance, we harmonize, not because we all have the same tone and play the same note, but because we hear every note as individual and special, and every instrument is being individual and special. And then we look for the place where they work together. If you ever studied music, then you know that some of the most beautiful passages begin with discord, and that it becomes beautiful when it's resolved harmoniously. So, the Buddha usually talked about tolerance in terms of spiritual practice, but there's a discourse on tolerance where he says that what it looks like. He says an intolerant individual, when insulted, returns the insult. When abused, returns the abuse. When bickered with, bickers in return. So if we go back to that process that I was talking about, when somebody meets disagreement or disagreeableness, the intolerant one doesn't accept it. He rejects it verbally or physically or whatever. The tolerant person starts by not returning the insult, doesn't return the abuse, doesn't bicker in return. So at its base, to practice intolerance, we have to not react to negativity, real or perceived, with more negativity. It doesn't mean not to react. It means we don't return hate with hate. And then the Buddha says this is beyond the basic tolerance to something even better, to what he calls self-control practice. And now when the insult is perceived, the self-controlled person doesn't cling to it or push it away. He restrains his reactions. And without that kind of restraint, then things like greed or stress can overcome us. So we guard our mind against thoughts that might lead to clinging or aversion. The Buddha never says, here's how you can tell right from who's right and who's wrong. He says, here's how you argue more skillfully. So to prevent the arising of our anger, greed, and delusion, that's the first step. It doesn't mean we become indifferent. It means that we can do what's right without being entrapped by our own prejudices. And this is, kind of a good way of looking at this is in the terms of that first tenet in Zen Peacemakers. And by the way, I'm not really involved with that group very much or anything like that. I'm by no means an expert on them. I have this kind of distant relationship with them, but this idea that we approach this first from a place of not knowing is very important, and it makes a lot of sense to me. So when thoughts of desire, anger, harmfulness, and other unskillful qualities arise, we recognize those things as something that we want to change and work with. So the Buddha says, you know these, then demolish them and wipe them out of existence. He's talking about them as they appear in our own hearts. Anger, harmfulness, things like that, when they arise in our hearts, the first step is to recognize that in our own mind and transcend it in our own mind. That doesn't mean that we ignore them in society, because this is, the second step and the third step, or the tenet, rather, in Zen Peacemakers, is to bear witness, see what's happening, and then to take action. So when we get to the bearing witness part, that we can actually kind of break that down a little bit too. So there's a guy, a peace researcher, Norwegian guy named Galton. And he's identified the way violence works in society and says, if we want to deal with violence in society, we have to understand it in all its forms, and then we have to build peace in its forms. And so the most obvious form of violence is direct violence. A police officer with his knee on a man's neck, that's about as direct violence as you can find. That's an action that threatens life or diminishes someone's capacity to meet their basic needs. Killing, maiming, slavery, bullying, sexual assault, emotional abuse, those are all forms of direct violence. And I think we see that fairly clearly. What's a little bit less easy to see clearly is structural violence. These are systems that hinder a group's access to opportunities, goods, and services. So they can be formal. Apartheid is an example of that. Jim Crow laws of the before the civil rights movement. Culturally functional things also, like limited access to education or healthcare for minorities. We're going to experience the results of cultural violence in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, because we have some functional things in place that have made it affect minority communities more and poor people more. So that's an example of that. When we have a system in place that doesn't protect everyone equally, some people suffer more than others. And that's an example of structural violence. And we're going to be dealing with the aftermath of that probably for a few generations, unless we really recognize it and do something about it. And then cultural violence, and this is a challenging one. Social norms and common attitudes that make direct and structural violence seem natural or acceptable. So the belief that one race is inherently inferior to another, for example, is used to rationalize things like slavery and to rationalize the perpetuation of structural violence. Beliefs like that can become so embedded in a culture that they seem absolute and inevitable, and they can go on unquestioned from one generation to another. So, as I said, direct violence is pretty easy to spot. You see a video of police brutality, and you go, okay, that's it. You can look at statistics on conviction and incarceration; those are available, and and that's a form of direct violence also. You put someone in prison and take away their freedom, that's violence. But to change these things, some of these things, we have to address the structural violence, and that's not as obvious. And then cultural violence manifests in things like the belief that, well, the structure needs to be in place because there's a higher rate of criminality among black males than white males. And then there's cultural violence against even the dialogue about the issue. And this is one of the problems we're having right now, is that the political leadership should be responding by going, yes, this is really bad. We need to change the systems that lead to police brutality. And instead, they're saying we need to do something about these protesters. A really good example of that was the Take a Knee protest in the NFL. And we had political leaders referring to football players who wanted to do one of the few things they could think of to do to protest this horrible situation by referring to them in very crude, disparaging terms. And then shifting the conversation so that instead of having to talk about police brutality, we can talk about disrespecting the flag. And that's really, if there was a conversation between two individuals arguing about some household matter or whatever, if somebody shifted the dialogue that way, you'd say that was really passive aggressive. When it's at the political system level, it's more than just passive aggressive. No, I think it's passive. I think it's aggressive. And when you just don't allow the dialogue to happen by shifting it to something else and saying, oh, this person who's trying to prevent people from being killed is disrespecting the troops or whatever, that's just shameful. And it is just shameful. So in order to change this, we have to be able to go, yes, this thing is happening. We need to be able to talk about it. So some of you probably clicked off because you're mad at me, or you're still listening. If you're mad at me, what do you want to say? What else I have to say? So the flag and the anthem are powerful symbols. I get that. To a lot of Americans, they represent the sacrifices made by, veterans and all of that. I understand. To show disrespect for those symbols can be deeply troubling. And I understand if you're one of those people, why that's important to you. But I came of age at a different time and place, doesn't have the same resonance for me. You swap disrespect the flag for disrespect to Buddha, I might feel similarly. But it demonstrates how emotionally and spiritually complex an attempt at peace building can be. It's not as easy as saying, well, we just all have to do this, because that's not necessarily the case. We can have a little bit more room to act sometimes when it comes to cultural violence. We can make a point of seeing it for what it is, and we can pressure legislators to change laws and pressure bureaucracies to change regulations. But if we want to live in a less violent world, we have to address cultural violence, even when we don't want to. Fortunately, this is where we as individuals have the most opportunity to create change. This is where we can put our spiritual values into action. If we want to build a peaceful society, we have to be aware of how our beliefs and attitudes can get in the way of making that peace a reality. And then we can see more clearly the truth of our situation, including things like our interdependency with others. I know a lot of you want to protest, and I think that you should look for good, skillful ways to protest police brutality, to protest injustice within the criminal system. We need to do what we can to change and erase uh, attitudes that someone who doesn't agree with us doesn't deserve to be a part of the conversation. The there was a video of a Texas politician, I don't remember his name, talking to a group of cowboys and saying the only good Democrat is a dead Democrat. We really need to eliminate that kind of thinking and the idea that that kind of speech is okay. But we need to be able to see how our own beliefs and attitudes can get in the way of making peace a reality. And we need to see clearly the truth of our situation, including our interdependence with others. Gail May-Kabose, who once gave a talk on tolerance at a Brotherhood dinner, and this was around 1960. So this would have been as the civil rights movement was really gaining some steam. And he said, brotherhood is not merely a word or ideal, it's a reality. He didn't say we want to make it a reality. He said it is a reality. And he went on to say, what I am, my very existence, the very fact of my presence here and now is the result of brotherhood. If I should start to analyze all the involvements of brotherhood in which I'm indebted, it would take uncountable time. If a person hates members of a certain race or religion, he should not eat or use anything produced by them. And this is impossible. Whether you like it or not, there is brotherhood and you are a part of it. I like that there is brotherhood and you're a part of it. Whether you like it or not, whether you reject it or not, it's really kind of beside the point. You know, we are all really in this together. Whether we agree with one another or not, it's beside the point. So this, I'm going to go ahead and say the dedication, and then I'm going to go see where I left my phone so I can look and see if any of you have asked me any questions or said horrible, disparaging things to me. And it's okay. I would get it if you did. Buddha nature pervades the whole universe, existing right here now, and offering flowers, candles, and incense, hearing the Dharma and training the mind. Great merit is attained. We dedicate this merit to the great Master Shakyamuni Buddha, Honored One, the all-pervading and everlasting three treasures, to the 16 guardians and all protectors of the Dharma, their relations throughout space and time, to all ancestors of the Sangha and all beings in the Dharma world. May penetrating light dispel the darkness of ignorance. Let all karma be resolved in the mind flower bloom in eternal spring. May the Dharma body maintain strength and health, and years of life be lengthened for all teachers of this Sangha. May their vows be fully realized, and may they live in perfect peace with Buddha Dharma. We pray for all those suffering from violence and those who grieve for them, for all those living in oppression, for all who are in prison who should be free, for all refugees from violence, hunger, catastrophe, man-made or natural. We pray for the health and well-being of all those suffering from diseases of body, mind, or spirit, all those working toward the healing of those afflictions. We pray for all those suffering from COVID-19, those working to protect and treat them, for all those grieving for those lost to this pandemic. We have members of our congregations, friends and loved ones suffering from diseases, and others who are grieving for lost loved ones. We pray for them and send loving thoughts their way. We pray for the families of those lost to gun violence. We pray for the families of those lost to brutality. We pray for those trying to keep peace and create order in those places that are racked by violence and rioting now. May they all be serene through all their troubles, and may we realize the enlightened way together. Sabbe sata sadahantu avera sukajivino katam punya phalang maham sabbe bhagi bhavantute. May all beings always live happily, free from animosity. May all share in the blessings that spring from the good we have done. I'll be right back. Well, I'm glad that you found this helpful, or at least open to discussing it. I understand you're struggling not to despair. Jennifer, thank you. I'm not sure I'm awesome, but I appreciate your feedback. I'm not sure what you're talking about with the Vimeo. Oh, the Zoom chat, that one? Is that what you're talking about? So Thursday, so I give Dharma talks on YouTube on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. and then on Thursdays at 6 on Zoom, and those are pretty controversial. Not controversial. Sorry, conversational. And do you have our email address? I think you do. If you email me, I'll send you the link to the Zoom meeting. I don't like posting it. Yeah, okay. Email me and I'll send you the link to the Zoom meeting. That's all you need to get in. If you don't have Zoom, you'll have to download it. I did that before. But yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions? All right, I don't see any more questions, so thank you all for being here. And and I look forward to seeing you Wednesday or Thursday or both. Have a good Sunday.